Hello, I'm honored to be presenting to you on the TWU Innovation Series about Techno-Racism. My name is Jennifer Adkins, and I'm the VP Inclusive Excellence at Trinity Western University. I'm a sociologist specializing in race and ethnicity and have consulted with organizations in equity, diversity, and inclusion for over 20 years. So why is a sociologist who studies race and ethnicity talking to you about technology? That's a great question. And I wondered the same thing at first until I recognized that there is a clear link. The way we socialize with each other feeds into larger systems of interaction, which acts as building blocks to what we call our society. In our society, we participate in social structures and systems on a daily basis. In fact, social media platforms are one of the newest social systems that we've become completely dependent on. These platforms have opened doors, allowing us to reach out to family and friends from far away and people from our past. We also enjoy the convenience of virtual assistants, digital streaming of music and videos, e-commerce, search engines, instant messaging, interactive messaging, and gaming, and so many other application and web-based options conveniently located on our computers and cell phones. I'm sure that this all sounds quite unimpressive, as you're likely interacting with most of this technology. But this social system or network is the link that I see to sociology. You might still be wondering, how is it possible for technology to be racist? So let me continue by inserting some sociological knowledge about the development of social institutions. Social institutions like the economy, government, education, medicine, justice, legal, and mass media were introduced to society. The architects of these institutions in North America and Europe were primarily white men. Their input and standards were put into place to fulfill the needs that they identified. It would naturally follow that women, Indigenous people, people of color, and people with disabilities, all left out of the planning process, were unconsciously or consciously marginalized from fully participating or contributing to the development of primary institutions. They lacked the input and power to influence decisions. In turn, they were, and in many cases still are, unable to reap the benefits or to be fully served by the institutions and their processes. Naturally, the biases and stereotypes creep into the policies and procedures. Prejudicial ways of thinking about these groups as outsiders, incapable, unworthy, unhealthy, unintelligent, and even unhuman inform how these groups are viewed and treated. Discriminatory behavior, including sexism, racism, and ableism, are the byproducts that shape institutional structures and systems. Measures to keep these groups out or in less desired positions were essentially baked into the policies and practices. With the naked eye, these barriers and inequities might not be obvious, but basic statistical analysis show that discrimination continues to exist. This can be witnessed in health and medical standards based on white men and boys, resulting in missed or misdiagnosed diseases in other groups. Limited representation in executive and leadership positions in organizations, lower pay for these designated groups, bank loans and mortgages denied, over-policing and arrests with particular groups in specific areas, just to name a few ongoing issues. I'll expand on the last issue, since it's a clear and current example. Like many other countries, police services in Canada adopted a carding program, or what is also known as street checks. In the United States, it's referred to as stop and frisk. This process allowed police officers to stop people that they might consider to be suspicious, ask to see their identification, and ask them a series of personal questions. During its Canadian origins in the 1950s, the individuals' names were scribbled down on suspect cards and cataloged. Recording information on a card evolved into writing a document and eventually into writing a full report. Each time the same individual was stopped while walking or driving down the street, more information was collected. With technological age came the sophistication of adding the names and all the information into computer databases used throughout North America, with no clear explanation of how it was being used. Those who were stopped by law enforcement were specifically young Indigenous men and men of color, especially Black men. In 2 years, from 2009 to 2011, it was recorded that 1.1 million names were added in Toronto, about 1 in every 3 Torontonians. Black men were 17 times more likely to be carded. To make matters worse, these database records were shared with key partners in different districts and organizations, posing serious problems by preventing those in the database from traveling to the United States and from getting jobs, even though they hadn't committed a crime. By comparison, in 2011, New York police stopped 680,000 people in just 1 year during the height of their stop and frisk program. The major issue is that the young men had their names and personal information collected in a database and dispersed when they had not committed a crime and when there was not an investigation taking place. Although some argue that this is a preventative measure, it has not yet been verified that it actually worked as one. In fact, research shows that the practice did not reduce crime, since cities that were not practicing in carding saw the same pattern of crime increasing and decreasing, even though they didn't use the carding system. In addition, carding in Ontario was deemed illegal by the ombudsperson after being challenged as a system violation of people's charter rights, human rights, and privacy rights. Carding was eventually banned from most Canadian cities, yet racial profiling continues to take place. Similarly, in New York, a federal judge ruled in favor of a class action lawsuit against stop and frisk, claiming that race was a stronger indicator of who would be stopped rather than the potential of crime itself. One would think that these rulings against the police collecting big data would deter the practice, but instead, big data continues to be used to predict crime by way of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Information is acquired less from asking individuals questions these days. Instead, algorithms are used to analyze, interpret, and sift through the massive amounts of police records and surveillance technologies to provide predicted details like who the offender and victim will be, as well as the time and the location of the crime. If you've seen Steven Spielberg's Minority Report starring Tom Cruise, you've witnessed the Hollywood version of predictive policing. Using enormous amounts of data in this manner has become so popular that it's referred to as big data policing. The algorithms produce crime hotspots mapping various locations and heat lists of people most likely to be victims or perpetrators. What might be included in the big data? Police body cams, automated license plate readers, audio collection, chemical detection devices, facial images, DNA, iris scans, and more. Our personal data includes anything that is available from mobile and computer apps. Cell location data, map records, social media, camera information, Google searches, purchases, steps taken, workout routines, diets, entertainment, your calendar information, and the like. Although these methods have been used around the world by police forces for at least a decade, studies reveal that they have not changed the rate of solving or reducing crimes. When asked in his interview with The Economist newspaper about potential issues that could arise using big data and preventative policing, Andrew Ferguson, a former public defender and currently a university professor of law, said that there are several potentials for abuse. He listed 4 in his conversation with The Economist. Number 1, if an area is considered at risk for violent crimes, officers will likely use unnecessary force during routine encounters. Number 2, as public anonymity is diminished by the web of growing surveillance, people feel at risk when articulating and defending their rights and freedoms. Number 3, Police have access to massive amounts of personal information of people not suspected or guilty of crime. Policies are incapable of protecting citizens in this situation. Number 4, long-standing historical, racial, and social biases are simply reified or made concrete in the data. We can't divorce our skewed views from technology. This final point of long-standing racism and other discriminatory practices carries us to the next section of my presentation, where I discuss how racism can actually be baked into technology. Let me start with a local example involving 2 professors from TWU and University of Victoria. Colin Madlin, who is a doctoral researcher and a sessional instructor at UVic, and also a director of TWU Online Learning and Instructional Technologies, and Maxwell Ofosuhene, professor at TWU in the Department of Geography and Environment. In September 2020, during a faculty meeting, Maxwell expressed having difficulty with Zoom when he uses a virtual background. Essentially, he was erased. If he moved away from the camera ever so slightly, his head would disappear. Colin, who is white, suggested that it might be Maxwell's darker skin tone. Maxwell is black. In attempting to resolve the situation, the 2 came to the conclusion that Maxwell would have to sit close to the camera, buy powerful front-facing lighting, and invest in a camera upgrade. Colin would not have to spend extra money since the technology was made with him in mind. Colin posted this incident to Twitter with Maxwell's permission and noticed that Twitter's algorithm cropped the image so that only Colin was visible. Maxwell was cropped out. Colin flipped the image so that they were on opposite sides and uploaded it again to Twitter, only to discover that the Twitter algorithm defaulted to the left side, showing him and hiding Maxwell once again. The software guesses what is relevant in pictures, and it decided that Maxwell was not. Twitter had issues with the saliency prediction model in the past, but then claimed that they did not find evidence of racial bias at the time. After a Twitter storm of comments came in to respond to Colin's post, both Twitter and Zoom immediately reached out to him, promising to rectify the issue. This experience echoes that of Judy Bolamwini, who is of Ghanaian descent, born in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and raised and educated in the US. Bolamwini is a computer scientist and digital activist at the MIT Media Lab. She is also the founder of the Algorithmic Justice League. The incident took place when Judy was working on creating an Aspire mirror at MIT. This project was intended to use facial recognition to allow users to reflect the face of a person who inspires them onto their own face. It worked well on her friends who had lighter skin, but she quickly realized that the technology would not recognize her face until she put on a white mask. Her following project, called Gender Shades, prompted IBM and Microsoft to adapt their software to more accurately recognize darker males and females. In auditing the facial recognition technology of IBM, Microsoft, and Face++, Judy found that they all performed better on male faces than female faces, and on lighter faces than on darker ones. Not surprisingly, white men had 100% accuracy in IBM and Microsoft's facial recognition technology. After they adapted their software, these results had improved. Judy concluded that data is a reflection of our history, since technology, like all other social arenas, is shaped by those with power. It has come to the awareness of many more researchers that technology simply reflects and proceeds with inequalities that exist in society. Until issues of discrimination are corrected with, they will persist on both individual and systemic levels. Who has the power to shape technology? You may have heard about Timnit Gebru when she was fired from Google. During her PhD, Dr. Gebru wrote a paper about AI and her concerns about the field. Later, while working with Google in 2019 as a co-leader of ethics in artificial intelligence, she had an interview with the New York Times where she expressed concerns for the use of facial recognition in law enforcement. She was later released from her job at Google for not withdrawing a paper that laid out the risks of large language models and the potential biases and dangers involved with pursuing the development. Her example shows that it is difficult to speak up against the big technological companies and insist on transparency and ethical processes if it'll get in the way of them making a profit. Government legislation and standards lag behind technological development, while simultaneously new technology has more presence, control, and authority in our lives. How is all of the collected information being used today and in the future? How much say do we have in slowing it all down or stopping it altogether? There have been numerous publicized incidents of techno-racism from the top tech companies. Some examples include Safiya Umojo Noble's 2008 research on search engines. When entering the term Black girls into search engines, she found that 80% of the first page of the searches were all pornography sites. In 2015, a Google photo software labeled 2 Black women as gorillas. Google later apologized for this mishap. In 2016, a Microsoft AI bot named Tay was released into Twitter to learn common language, habits of Twitter users, and to engage with 18 to 24-year-olds. As a Duke University Press article put it, in 12 hours, Tay went from upbeat conversationalist to foul-mouthed, racist Holocaust denier who said feminists should all die and burn in hell. Tay was shut down 24 hours later. The bot was not pre-programmed to be racist, but the machine learning allowed it to pick up behaviors from Twitter users and develop algorithmic bias. In 2017, FaceApp software created to make users more attractive simply lightened darker skin tones to accomplish this. Similarly, TikTok's beauty filter turned out to make broad noses thinner. This all brings us back to the very serious usage of technology as facial recognition surveillance used by law enforcement to search for suspects. If technology can act in a racist manner, as witnessed in the above examples, how serious is it when it falsely accuses innocent people? In 2019, Najir Parks from New Jersey was a false facial recognition match and sent to jail for 11 days. In 2020, Robert Williams was arrested outside of his suburban home by the Detroit police because of a faulty facial recognition match. He was in jail for 30 hours before being cleared. In an interview with Washington Post, he asked, "How does one explain to his 2 little daughters that a computer got it wrong, but the police listened to it anyway?" In studying facial recognition algorithms, the National Institute of Standards of Technology found that Black and Asian faces are falsely identified 10 to 100 times more than white faces, leaving people of color more vulnerable to the threat of being falsely matched. A notable issue is that most people believe that algorithms are objective and neutral, failing to recognize that we as humans bring our history, politics, and perspectives with us in whatever we do, even when creating technology. When judges, police officers, airport attendants, employers, universities, and even smart home designers use algorithms, they assume that they have reduced the chance of human bias, conscious or otherwise. This is not the case. Machines learn from people and take on their biases. It's not that the technology is racist in and of itself, but human decision and input permeates its development. This is a systemic issue that requires great attention and mindful change. In the same way that we cannot simply wish for racism to disappear, good intentions will not address the issue of techno-racism and embedded subjectivity. The lack of diversity in the development of software does not only become evident, but it also perpetuates discrimination. In case of facial recognition for law enforcement, lives can be destroyed because of the use of faulty technology. The world is becoming increasingly more interconnected and diverse. It's compulsory to include people who are different in a variety of ways to be a part of technological development so that the blind spots can be addressed. We must continually ask whose interests are being served and what power dynamics are involved. Are we trading our privacy for convenience? And if so, how exactly is that data being used? Do we actually need intrusive technology like facial recognition and voice recognition software? Who gets to decide the best way to use it? Continual audits and government regulation and legislation are required. We need to recognize that artificial intelligence and machine learning cannot be objective because the humans creating them are not. Technology is littered with biases, just as we are. I also suggest that ethical, anti-bias, and anti-racism support be incorporated in the training of designers and programmers, since everyone is impacted by the final decisions that they make.